Hello! In this video, I want to share with you a brief summary of my theory on how comedy works and how to use it to come up with ideas for jokes and comedy sketches. So to begin with, I will tell you about the joke structure. So our minds think by recognizing patterns, and we are using these recognized patterns to make predictions. So for example, if you see a pattern like A, B, and C, your brain will automatically recognize that these three letters are a part of a pattern that we call alphabet. And your brain can now use this pattern to make a prediction about what comes next. So once you see three letters A, B, and C, you recognize a pattern, and you can predict the next letter D. This is useful for us to know because understanding patterns is important to understanding jokes. Jokes have two parts, a setup and a punchline. Setup leads people to recognize some kind of pattern, which their brains will use to automatically make predictions and assumptions. And then when we hear a punchline, it forces our brain to snap out of this pattern and to switch into a different pattern, which shatters our assumptions, predictions, and expectations, and makes it clear that the predictions we have made are invalid. And this is basically when we laugh. So let's take a joke as an example. My father had the heart of a lion and a lifetime ban from the Central Park Zoo. So over here we have a setup, which is my grandfather had the heart of a lion, which leads us to recognize a pattern, which is a brave grandfather who was probably like a warrior, and or maybe was just a badass person who was inspiring and cool. So this is the pattern that our brains automatically fill in once we hear these words. But then the punchline switches our interpretation of this pattern and makes us realize that we are actually talking about the actual heart of a lion. So when we hear "and a lifetime ban from the Central Park Zoo," we realize that instead of the pattern that we recognized initially, which is brave grandfather, we are actually talking about entirely different pattern, which is grandfather who actually stole a heart of a lion. So just to recap, the setup made us recognize the first pattern, a brave grandfather. The punchline made us switch to a second pattern, and these two patterns have one thing in common, a heart of a lion. Over here you see it is depicted as a common aspect. So in order for a joke to work, the two patterns must have something in common. A one thing with two different interpretations. This thing has two different meanings. Heart of a lion means bravery when we are talking about brave grandfather, and it means internal organ when we are talking about Central Park Zoo and the lion who this heart was stolen from. So this is basically the type of idea we want to find in order to create something funny, whether it's a joke or a comedy sketch. We want two patterns connected by a common aspect, which is a thing with two interpretations that belong to two wildly different and unrelated patterns. So here's another example. I have a step ladder. I never knew my real ladder. Here we have two patterns. One pattern is a step ladder. The second pattern is a stepfather, and a common aspect between them is the word step. It is often that in jokes that are based on wordplay, we have one word that connects two patterns together. But this connection does not have to be based on words. For example, here's another joke. I am very excited for the President's Day. I have already left milk and cookies for Lincoln. In this case, we are not reinterpreting some word in the setup, because there is no word that these two patterns have in common. Instead, our setup made us think about the pattern called President's Day, which is a holiday, and we can associate holiday with a different pattern, which is Christmas. And now we still have two patterns connected by one thing, except that it is not a word that you can see in the actual joke, but it is an aspect of a pattern that our brain has recognized when it heard the setup of the joke. So this reinterpretation of a common aspect is not limited to the wordplay-based jokes. This common aspect can be an abstract idea evoked by one of the patterns, or it can even be an image. So take a look here. At first, when you look at it, it looks like a letter L. So the default interpretation that your brain recognizes is that, well, this is a letter L. But when you see these two images, they make your brain realize that instead of a letter L, this picture actually depicts a figure from Tetris. So this is basically the visual depiction of how jokes work. We have some sort of pattern, we first interpret it in one way, and then something makes us recognize that we have interpreted it incorrectly, and we switch to a different interpretation. And here's a bunch more examples. So here we have a poster that at first looks like an iceberg, but then we reinterpret this image as a bag floating in the water. Over here we have an image that at first looks like a kiss, but then we realize that this guy is actually taking a bite out of a cheeseburger. Here we have a classic image of a lady that can be interpreted as a beautiful lady looking away from the camera, or as an ugly hag that is looking towards the camera. And here we have a comics where at first this looks like a sail, and then we realize that we have actually interpreted it incorrectly, and this is a soap bubble. So this is basically the fundamentals of how all comedy works. And now I want to tell you about how we can actually find these interesting ideas and funny connections. So fundamentally, at the core of any joke is an absurd association, an unexpected connection between two ideas. Two patterns that don't belong together but have one thing in common. So the common aspect, which is a one thing with two interpretations. In order to write a joke or come up with a funny idea for a sketch, we need to find two patterns that are connected by one thing. Then we can come up with a setup, which is a statement that leads people to recognize the first pattern, and a punchline, which is a statement that makes them to recognize the second pattern. So if we were writing this joke from scratch, we would try to find two patterns connected by the single word, and then express the first pattern as a setup and then the second pattern as a punchline. The important thing to understand here is that the less that these two patterns belong together, the farther they are from each other, the more contrast there is between them, the funnier and more interesting the joke will be. And the better these patterns are connected, the more this joke will make sense. So basically this is our main challenge. What we want to do is we want to find an absurd association. We want to have two patterns that are connected by one thing. We want each of the patterns to be closely related to this one thing. So we want the first pattern to be closely related to the common aspect and the second pattern to be closely related to the common aspect. But at the same time, we want these two patterns to be as different from each other as possible. So just to give you an example, if the first pattern is cat and the common aspect is paws or fur and the second pattern is dog, it is a valid association, but it is not very funny or interesting because it is too obvious. Cat and dog are ideas that are not very different from each other. On the other hand, if the first pattern is a cat, the common aspect is 9 lives, so cats have 9 lives, and the second pattern is video games. In video games, you often have multiple lives. That is much better, because now we have two very different ideas, cat and video games, connected by one thing, which is 9 lives. So we need to be able to find absurd associations, surprising connections between unrelated ideas. To do that, we need to understand something I call aspects. All patterns are made out of smaller patterns and are a part of bigger patterns. So take a look at this diagram here. We have a big category of things which is called creatures. And if you think about it, you can find multiple different patterns that belong to this bigger pattern. So wild animals, pets, and fantasy beasts, and many other things, and like bacteria and whatever else is creatures. But if you take a look at the pets, we can also break it down into multiple smaller patterns. Dogs, cats, fish, and if you take a look at the cat, you can also see that you can break it down into even smaller patterns, such as tail, meowing, 9 lives. So when you think about a cat, it makes you think about multiple different aspects of this animal. So any pattern is made out of many smaller patterns and is a part of many bigger patterns. So when you think about a cat, you can think about breaking it down into a bunch of smaller patterns, like pointy ears, night vision, fur, paws, being lazy, and so on. And a cat is also belongs to a bunch of more abstract, higher level patterns, such as pets, animals, small creatures, things that bring bad luck, things that sound like a bat, things that sleep on my couch. This way you can take one idea, like cat, and break it down into a bunch of other related ideas. Because aspects are such an important concept, I want to give you a few more examples. The easiest way to break down the pattern into aspects is to take a look at this list and to think about the related characters, locations, things, nouns, actions and behaviors, verbs, and characteristics, adjectives that this pattern makes you think of. These are the smaller patterns that are a part of your pattern that you're looking at. You can also look for aspects that are a part of the bigger patterns. You can look for abstract categories this pattern belongs to, descriptions, statements, opinions about it, questions about it, analogies, assumptions, expectations, annoying, exciting, weird things about it, things it symbolizes, mental images it evokes. Basically any kinds of patterns this pattern is a part of. Here's an example. Let's take a simple pattern which is a cell phone, just a single idea. Here are the aspects that we immediately think of when we think about a cell phone. So a teenager, cell phone factory, camera, battery, texting, calling, expensive, addictive. And you can also look for more abstract patterns such as brilliant inventions, things you can't use on an airplane, something that brings me bad news in the morning, something that is worth waiting 8 hours in line for, something that you angrily scream into, something that every kid in school wants, tool for a long-distance relationships, my only connection to the outside world, symbol of my generation's laziness. Aspects like this are more abstract, they are less obvious, and you have to put some creative energy into making them up, but when you come up with one successfully, they result in more interesting jokes and more creative associations. So in order to find associations, take a pattern, break it down into a bunch of aspects, take one of the aspects out of context, and then find a different pattern this aspect belongs to. For example, let's take a cat. We break it down into a bunch of different aspects. Pointy ears, night vision, tail, paws, lazy, meows, fur, and has 9 lives. So these are the things that your brain naturally thinks of when you think about a cat. Let's take one of the aspects, 9 lives, and take it out of context. And when I say take it out of context, I mean just focus on this one specific aspect and forget about the original pattern that made you think of it. So now that you have picked 9 lives, you forget about the cat and try to find other patterns that this aspect belongs to. So what else do you think of when you hear 9 lives? Well, video games is a pattern that also contains this aspect. And now that we have found this association, we can write a joke. Why are cats so good at video games? Because they have 9 lives. So just to recap, we can take a topic, we can list a bunch of aspects of this topic, we can take one of these aspects out of context, and then we can find other different patterns that this aspect belongs to. And that allows us to find surprising, interesting, absurd associations, which allow us to make jokes. Finally, one last thing we need to do is to actually write a joke. So once we have an absurd association, a surprising connection between the two patterns, the only thing we need to do is to combine these patterns together. And we do that by taking an aspect of one pattern and applying it to another pattern. We take an aspect from the first pattern and apply it to the second pattern, or vice versa. So just to use a joke that we looked at before as an example, I am very excited for the President's Day. I have already left milk and cookies for Lincoln. We have two patterns, Christmas and President's Day. They are connected by a common aspect, which is holiday. And now in order to write joke, we take an aspect from Christmas, which is milk and cookies, and we apply it to the President's Day. So we are saying that I have already left milk and cookies for Lincoln. And that is how most of the jokes and funny ideas work. And here are a few examples of ideas created using this method. So the first step is to take some kind of topic or a situation, such as jogging in the morning. Next, I want to name one of its aspects and take it out of context. So I write it down here. The next step is to try to come up with an absurd association. So take the aspect of running and think about an idea that still involves running but is as different from jogging in the morning as possible. So in this case, I'm going to write running a program, like in a computer. Finally, the last step is to mix the ideas, to take some aspect of jogging in the morning and apply it to the idea of running a program, or vice versa. So in this case, I'm going to take an aspect of running a program, which makes me think about old software like Windows 95 and how it was really slow, and I'm going to apply it to the concept of jogging. So I'm going to say, I'm awful at jogging. I'm running slower than Windows 95. And let's quickly go through a few more examples. I'm going to take an idea of baking a cake, think about its aspects, and one of them is making food. I'm going to take it out of context, forget about baking a cake, and think about what is the most different situation that involves making food. And that makes me think about cavemen, hunting and gathering. And now I'm going to combine these two ideas. So imagine hunting wild cakes. And I can even express it as a line of dialogue. I am not supposed to be able to make you a cake. I am a man. I'd do it only if I could go into the wild, hunt down, and slaughter a herd of wild cakes. The initial ideas can be anything. So it can be just a topic, or a scene, or a situation, or even a line of dialogue. So let's say I take a line of dialogue such as, you are such a great guy. I'm going to extract the words great guy out of context and think about a way to reinterpret them. Great guy makes me think of Abraham Lincoln, which is a concept very different from just me being called a great guy. And then I mix these ideas. So one person maybe says, you're such a great guy. And I respond, I'm not a great guy. Abraham Lincoln was a great guy. I'm a barely adequate guy. And here's another one. We take the idea of a haunted house. One of its aspects is that it's quiet. We associate it to something as different from the haunted house as possible. In this case, awkward first date. And then we mix these ideas. This haunted house is quieter than a nerd's first date. Here's one more. My room is messy. I'm trying to take an aspect that I could reinterpret in some interesting way, such as things that cause a big mess, and it makes me think about the most absurd thing that can cause a big mess, which is turning into a werewolf. And now I can think about a line of dialogue that mixes aspects of these ideas. Your room is so messy, it looks like you've been turning into a werewolf in here.